the reason that people were so historically suspicious about love is that marriage for thousands of years had very little to do with the individual relationship between a man and a woman. I'm old enough to remember I grew up in the 60s when the anthropologists were telling us that marriage was invented to protect women and children. And then a lot of feminist anthropologists came along in the 70s and said, no, 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 marriage was invented to oppress women and children. And the more I study marriage, the more I'm convinced that the invention of marriage had nothing at all to do with the relationship between the man and the woman. Marriage was invented to get in-laws. It was a way of turning strangers into relatives, of making peace. That's why the word for wife in many languages means peace weaver. As societies became more stratified, marriage became a way of getting connected in-laws. And as such, it became a center of maneuvering and control and coercion and betrayal for thousands and thousands of years. The upper class used marriage to seal military alliances, to sign peace treaties, to consolidate wealth, to increase their claim to social power. You know, my son is, we're descended from Charlemagne, and so I need to marry someone also descended from Charlemagne in order to strengthen my claim to the throne. For the middle classes, it was a business alliance, a way of getting connected in-laws, and even in the lower classes, it was a way of expanding your family labor force, getting new connections. So love, for thousands of years, marriage was just much too important to leave it up to individual choice, and especially an individual choice based on something so irrational as the feeling of love. As I said, it wasn't until the late 18th century that this new radical idea came along. Part of it was the Enlightenment, the idea that the older generation shouldn't dictate to the younger, and the state shouldn't dictate to the younger generation. And part of it were the individualistic ideas of the revolutionary era in France and America, the Declaration of Independence, with its claim that people are entitled to the pursuit of happiness, and that goes for personal relationships as well. And they ought to pursue happiness in marriage and on the basis of love. And you know what's fascinating is that immediately social conservatives of the day, defenders of what was then the traditional marriage, political and economic convenience, were absolutely horrified. They said, oh my gosh, if you make marriage about love, how are we going to get the right people to marry? You know, if my son can say, I don't love her, you know, stupid reason like that. How are we going to prevent the wrong people from marrying? Today, the debate is, well, you know, gays and lesbians are saying, well, if marriage is about love and sexual satisfaction and it no longer has to be about gender roles, why can't we have access to marriage? In the 18th century, they were afraid that poor people would want access to marriage. The other thing they were worried about is, if you say marriage is about love and mutual respect, what's going to prevent people from demanding a divorce? If the marriage does not turn out to be about that? What's going to prevent people from saying, hey, it's just as respectable to have a love child? It's no accident that children born outside of marriage were called love children through the ages. That it's just as respectable to have a love child as it is to enter a marriage that is not based on love. And what scared them more than anything was if you tell people that marriage is about love, men who expect to love their wives might start giving in to them, and then where are we going to end up? Almost, and we're getting there. In other words, they were frightened that marriage might be, that love might be the death of marriage. And you know, they had a very good point. Because that is a very radical, destabilizing idea. For 150 years, right up through the 1950s and 1960s, though, those destabilizing aspects of the notion of marrying for love were held in check by laws that prevented people from just getting divorced when they wanted to, by the penalties for illegitimacy that made it very difficult to have a love child without marriage, by the economic and legal subordination of women, and by the very strict gender roles between husband and wives that sort of made it that a woman couldn't exist without a man to be the breadwinner, and a man couldn't exist without a woman to take care of the children and the family and cook the meals and all that sort of thing. Well, in the last 35 years, all of those obstacles to the radical implications of the love match have been overturned. And the result has been a tremendous paradox, a paradox that in my own rigid, linear way, I think I can relate to Liz's work on happiness. But that I want to start by just outlining it, that the very things that have made marriage as a relationship and as a love relationship more rewarding have made marriage as an institution less stable. And we end up with this paradox that when it works, a marriage today is fairer, more fulfilling, more intimate, more passionate, more faithful, more loving than most couples of the past would ever have dared to imagine. But if it doesn't work that way, it seems less bearable to people. And relationships that might have seemed bearable 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, just seem intolerable as our expectations have arisen. Now, some people conclude from that we should lower our expectations of marriage. I wouldn't argue that, having studied the low expectation marriages of the past. But I think we have to redefine our notions of love.